There's a moment, and if you've lived long enough, you know the one, where everything you thought you understood about a person collapses into something smaller and truer and more terrifying than anything you'd prepared yourself for. I've watched men die with their boots on. I've watched women bury children in the hardest ground this territory ever produced. I've ridden through 3 days of snow without a fire and come out the other side owing nothing to luck and everything to stubbornness. But I was not ready for that kitchen. I was not ready for what he whispered. And I'm still not sure, all these months later, sitting here by the stove with my log open and my pen shaking slightly in the cold, whether what I witnessed in that moment was love or grief or something the Apache people carry in their blood that doesn't have a word in English. Maybe it doesn't need one. Maybe some things are true before they are named. This is the story I've been trying to write since November. I keep starting it wrong, starting it too late or too early or in the wrong room entirely. So this time I'm starting it exactly where it begins, not with the whisper, not with the counter, not even with the man. I'm starting it with the fire that burned the canyon and the girl who ran toward it. I keep a log. It's not a journal. I want to be clear about that distinction because journals are for men with feelings they're comfortable examining, and I am not yet that kind of man, though I've been working on it since my wife left and took the good blanket and most of my certainty about the world. A log is different. A log is practical. Dates, distances, observations, what I saw, not what I felt about it, who was present, what was said, what the weather did. I've kept one since I was 17 years old, riding as a junior hand on my Uncle Clem's spread in the Sangre de Cristos, and it's a habit that has saved my life twice, that I know of and probably more times than I give it credit for. You'd be amazed how often writing something down makes you look at it differently. You'd be amazed how often what you thought was a simple fact turns out to be a question once it's on the page. November 4th, 1883. That's what the log says at the top of the first entry from that week. Arrived Cielo Rojo Basin 9 days out of Santa Fe. Fire visible on eastern ridge since before dawn. Joined a loose company of 7 riders, mixed ranchers and freighters, sheltering near the creek bed at the canyon's mouth. Wind from the southwest. Smoke moving north. That's what I wrote. What I didn't write, because it wasn't a log entry kind of detail, though I've since added a notation in the margin, was that the first thing I noticed when I rode into that loose company of 7 riders was the girl. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the way that people who are built for difficult terrain tend to be, lean and deliberate and carrying nothing extra. I noticed her because she was the only person in that gathering who was facing the wrong direction. Everyone else was watching the fire. Their eyes were up on the eastern ridge, tracking the orange crawl of it through the pine cover, calculating in the rancher's instinctive way how fast it was moving and what direction and whether they needed to be somewhere else very soon. It's a particular kind of attention, not panic, not calm exactly, just a continuous arithmetic of danger. She was watching the canyon entrance. Standing apart from the others, arms loose at her sides, one hand resting on the horn of the saddle she'd draped over a boulder. Apache, I could see that immediately. The cut of her clothing, the style of her moccasins, the particular stillness that I'd learned in 18 months of working this territory was not hostility, but simply a different relationship to space than the one I'd grown up with. The stillness of people who understand that being noticed is often the first step toward being in danger. Her name, I learned it later, much later, from the man who matters most in this story, was Sagara, which in her dialect meant something close to the one who remains, which was a name that, once I knew it, I could not stop turning over in my mouth like a river stone. She was watching the canyon entrance because she was waiting for someone. I didn't know that yet. What I knew was that the fire was moving and the wind was pushing it, and the loose company of 7 ranchers and freighters was beginning to talk with increasing speed about whether to ride north along the creek or take the longer route through the mesa and add 3 hours to everyone's journey. I dismounted, tied my horse, a rangy red dun named Trouble because I was 17 when I named him and thought that was clever, to a scrub oak that looked like it had opinions about the situation. Got my canteen, walked to the edge of the group to listen. Can't know how fast it's moving without somebody going up there, one of the freighters was saying. He was a big man, whether the way fence posts get weathered, which is to say down to the grain. Could be running, could be crawling, makes all the difference. Nobody's going up there, said a woman rancher whose name I got as Della Cross. She had a voice like a gate hinge, not unpleasant, but impossible to ignore. That's how you end up dead in a fire instead of just inconvenienced by one. Could send one rider, light and fast. To do what? Count the trees. To count how many minutes we've got. I looked over at Sagara. She was still watching the canyon entrance, and now I could see the tension in her that hadn't been visible from a distance. The slight forward lean, the way her weight was distributed on her feet, ready, not anxious. Ready. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. She's waiting for someone, I said, to no one in particular. The freighter glanced at me. What's that? The woman over there. She's not worried about the fire. She's waiting for someone to come through that canyon. There was a brief silence of the kind that happens in groups of strangers, when one member says something that requires everyone to recalibrate their picture of the situation. Then Delacroix said, "Well, that's her business, isn't it?" and turned back to the discussion of routes. I wrote it in the log anyway. Woman, Apache, late 20s, watching canyon entrance. Waiting. Does not appear concerned with fire, and then I crossed out does not appear concerned and wrote has chosen a different concern. Which was more accurate? 15 minutes later, someone came through the canyon. I heard the horse before I saw it. A hard, driven sound, hooves on stone, the particular rhythm of a rider pushing past comfort. The group turned, hands going to guns out of reflex, that instinctive frontier tension that I'd learned to notice in myself and try to slow down before it made a decision for me. The rider who came out of the canyon mouth was Apache. A man, maybe 30, maybe a few years older. It was hard to tell in the smoke-filtered light. He was riding a paint horse that was breathing hard, and he was holding something against his chest with one arm, the other arm working the reins, and the something was a child. A girl, 4 years old, maybe 5. Wrapped in a blanket and pressed against his chest, and not moving in the way that made everyone in that company hold their breath for a half-second before releasing it. Sagara was already moving. Not running. I want to be precise about this, because running would have been the wrong word. She moved with a focused speed that ate distance without appearing to hurry, the way water finds its way downhill, and she reached the horse before the man had fully stopped it, and she had her arms up and he was transferring the child to her, and saying something in Apache, quick and low, and her face. I wrote it in the log that night. Her face when she received the child was the most complicated thing I have seen a human face do. I've been trying to improve on that description for months, and I can't. Relief and terror and love and grief all moving through her at once, like weather, like the fire on the ridge that was simultaneously beautiful and destroying everything in its path. She held the child against her shoulder and pressed her face into the child's hair and stood there for a moment. Just stood there in the middle of the chaos of horses and strangers and smoke and wind, and the rest of the world accommodated her. I don't know how else to say it. The rest of the world accommodated her. The conversation slowed. The horses quieted. Even the wind seemed to ease for a moment, though that might be memory improving on fact. The man dismounted. His name was Alu. I didn't know that yet. I learned it later in stages, the way you learn things when language is a country you're both visiting from different directions. But I was watching him while Sagara held the child, and what I saw on his face when he looked at the two of them together was something I recognized from a distance, and had to look away from. The way you look away from a fire not because it's frightening, but because looking directly at it for too long changes something in your eyes. He loved her. Not the sweet, simple love of early courtship. Something older. Something that had been tested and had come through the testing with new scars and new dimensions. The love of people who have stood in the same fire together and come out the other side knowing something about each other that cannot be explained to anyone who wasn't there. I know because I've seen it. I know because I used to have it before the good blanket left and took everything with it. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the problem with this story. It keeps pulling me forward when I need to stay in the moment. Stay in the cold canyon air with the smoke coming down from the ridge and the child beginning, slowly, to stir in Sagara's arms. The child was alive. I should have said that first. The child was alive and beginning to wake, and the first thing she did when she opened her eyes and found herself in Sagara's arms was reach up with one small hand and press her palm flat against Sagara's cheek. The gesture undid me completely. I had to turn away and look at the fire. Her name was Kaya. She was 4 years old, though I confirmed this later. At the time, I guessed younger, because she was small in the way of children who have recently been through something that spent them. She was Sagara's daughter, and Alu was her father, and the three of them were. I assembled this gradually, from observation and the limited translation offered by a freighter named Hooper who spoke some Apache, and a great deal more than he let on, in the middle of a journey that had been interrupted by the fire. They had a destination. I didn't learn where exactly, not that day. But the destination was important. You could see it in the way Alu kept looking back up at the canyon, calculating, and in the way Sagara kept looking at Kaya, then at the ridge, then at Alu, the three-point triangle of attention that told you she was holding all of it simultaneously and making continuous adjustments. Kaya had been carried ahead of the fire. Alu had been behind it. That was the piece I understood once I got it sorted. The fire had come fast, through the night, and had separated them. Sagara with the child ahead, Alu behind, and the canyon between them with fire on one side and smoke on all sides and nobody knowing for several hours whether the other half was still breathing. Sagara had waited at the canyon mouth since before dawn. 6 hours, maybe 7. While the fire moved and the smoke thickened, and the loose company of ranchers and freighters arrived and debated routes, and said that's her business, isn't it, and saddled and unsaddled and talked themselves in circles, she had stood at that canyon mouth and waited. Not because she was certain he was alive, because she had decided to wait until she knew otherwise. I thought about that for a long time. I'm still thinking about it. There's something in that choice, the decision to hold a position against uncertainty rather than retreat into the relief of not knowing, that I can't quite get my mind all the way around. It's not hope, exactly. It's more structural than hope. It's the refusal to let the story end before it's actually over. I know men who couldn't do that. I'm not certain I could. I wrote in the log, she waited. She knew he might not come. She waited anyway. And then I added, I don't have a word for what that is. Kaya was awake and beginning to be herself again by midday, which is to say she was examining everything within arm's reach and asking questions that I couldn't understand but could tell were questions by the rising inflection and by Sagara's patient, quiet answers. She was the kind of child who required engagement with the world. You could see it, the way she reached for things, the way her eyes tracked and assessed. Not reckless, curious. There is, again, a difference. Alu was tending to the paint horse, who deserved considerably more credit than he was getting from anyone other than Alu, who spoke to him low and steady while checking his legs for heat and finding none, which was a small grace in a day that needed all the small graces it could find. I found myself drifting toward them. Not intruding, I want to be clear about that, just orbiting, the way you orbit a fire when you're cold, the way you orbit people who seem to know something you don't. Hooper the freighter caught me at it and gave me a look that was not unkind. You're doing that thing, he said. What thing? That thing where you study people like they're going to explain something to you. Don't I look like that all the time? More so right now. I considered this. Something happened up in that canyon, I said. Fire happened. Something else. Hooper looked at the three of them, Alu with the horse, Sagara with Kaya in her lap now, the child pointing at something in the distance and asking about it. Probably, he said. Usually does when people get separated in a fire. He came back. He came back because his daughter was on the other side. He came back through fire. Hooper was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said, he did. We stood with that for a while. Around mid-afternoon, the wind shifted. It was small at first. You feel it in the smoke before you see it, a change in the direction of the stinging, and then it became definitive. The fire on the eastern ridge, which had been threatening to angle south toward the canyon mouth, began to drift north instead, toward the bare rock of the mesa where there was nothing left to burn. The arithmetic of danger changed. Delacroix was the first to recalculate it out loud. Winds turned, she said. We've got the route through the canyon again if people want it. The loose company stirred, routes were reconsidered. Horses were brought up. I looked at Alu. He was looking at the canyon, calculating again, and I watched him make the decision, saw it happen in his face, the shift from assessment to commitment. He said something to Sagara, and she looked at the canyon too, and then she looked at Kaya, and then she looked back at him, and something passed between them that was fast and wordless and complete. He was going back in. Not through the same passage he'd just come out of. I understood that much when I watched him begin to repack the horse. Through a different way. further south. There was something on the other side of that canyon that he needed to go back for, something that the fire and the separation had left unfinished, and he was going back. I wrote it that night. He looked at her and she looked at him and she let him go. And then I sat with my pen over the page for a long time, unable to explain why that sentence felt like the most remarkable thing I'd observed all day. In a day that had contained a woman waiting 7 hours at a canyon mouth, and a man riding through smoke with a child held against his chest. But it does. She let him go. Not without cost. I could see the cost in the way she held herself while he prepared the horse, the particular stillness of someone who has chosen not to hold on. The same structural refusal to let the story end before it was over, applied now to its mirror. The refusal to stop a story that needed to continue even when stopping it felt like survival. He mounted, said something. She said something back. He rode south along the canyon wall and was gone into the smoke within 5 minutes. Kaya watched him go, then looked at her mother, then pointed at something else entirely, a bird, I think, or something small and moving in the scrub, and asked about it. Sagara answered. Her voice was perfectly steady. I closed my log, sat down on a rock, and for the first time in a long while felt the specific weight of a life I didn't fully understand. That was the first part of it. The kitchen and the counter and the whisper came later. But I need you to know about the canyon first. I need you to know about waiting before I can tell you about the moment of arrival. I rode south because Hooper told me there was a trading post. This is the unglamorous truth of how I ended up where I ended up. Not destiny, not a calling, not the kind of narrative pull that stories like to pretend governs the movement of people through consequential moments. I rode south because I was running low on salt and coffee, and the next settlement north was 3 days out, and Hooper said there was a trading post at the southern bend of Cielo Rojo Basin, half a day's ride, run by a man named Cassius Webb who was cantankerous but reliable, and who kept a good store and charged honest prices, which is rarer in this territory than clean water. I made a note in the log, November 5th, riding south to Webb's post, low on salt, coffee, lamp oil, expected arrival midday. I arrived midday. The trading post was exactly what Hooper had described. Cantankerous architecture, reliable supplies, Cassius Webb in a leather apron standing behind the counter looking like a man who had been personally wronged by the concept of customers, and had made his peace with that, and continued to serve them out of a kind of resigned professionalism. He was maybe 60. He had a gray beard that he kept trimmed with more attention than the rest of his appearance, suggested, and hands that moved with the economy of a man who had handled goods for 30 years without breaking much. I bought salt, coffee, lamp oil, flour, 3 tins of something that claimed to be beans. We conducted our transaction with the minimal conversation appropriate to 2 strangers who have no shared history and no particular need to develop one. Then Cassius Webb said, "You just ride in from the basin." Yes. Fires settled then. Wind shifted, moved it north. He nodded slowly with the expression of a man filing information away. See anything unusual out there? Got word there was some trouble. I thought about the canyon, Sagara at the mouth of it, Elu coming through the smoke with Kaya pressed against his chest. Depends what you mean by unusual, I said. Apache family, man, woman, child. They were supposed to come through here 2 days ago. Something in my chest shifted. They were in the basin, I said, separated by the fire. They were all right when I left, the woman and child anyway. The man went back south. Cassius Webb looked at me steadily for a moment. Then he said, with a different quality of voice than he'd been using, "He's already here." The back of the trading post opened onto a small courtyard. Not the right word exactly. More of a functional outdoor space with a Linta stable on one side and a stone well in the middle, and a structure on the far side that was half storage and half living quarters, in the way of buildings that have been added onto over time without a strong original plan. Cassius Webb led me through it without preamble, which told me either that he was a man comfortable with assuming others' consent to follow him, or that he'd decided I was trustworthy, which might have been the same thing expressed differently. He came in 2 hours ago, he said. Came through the South Passage, brought what they'd left. What had they left? Their things. They'd left a pack with me before they went up into the basin. Tools, blankets, some medicine for Kaya. He paused. For Kaya's cough. I hadn't known about the cough. I wrote it in the log later. The child has been ill. The journey was not casual. And then I looked at what I'd written and thought about what it meant. The fire, the separation, the 7 hours of waiting at the canyon mouth. All of it layered now over the knowledge that the child was sick and the destination mattered for reasons beyond geography. The structure at the far end of the courtyard had a door standing open. I stopped at the entrance, not crossing it without cause, good manners, the same way you'd stop at a doorway before entering someone's house. Cassius Webb had continued past me and was already inside, speaking to someone, and I stood at the threshold with the afternoon light falling warm on the stone and tried to make myself into the kind of person who waits quietly. I could hear Alu's voice. Not the words, I didn't have enough Apache for that, not then, but the cadence of it. Low and continuous, like something being explained very carefully to someone who has been frightened and needs to understand that the frightening part is over. The particular register that exists in every language for the same purpose. I'm here. You're safe. Listen to me. I thought she's already here. And she was. When Cassius Webb came back to the door and gestured me in, with the look of a man doing something he'd made a particular private decision to do and was going to see through, I stepped into the structure and found all 3 of them. Sagara had come south by a different route, faster than expected. She was there with Kaya, and Kaya was on the wooden counter that ran along the far wall, sitting up with her legs dangling, and Alu was standing in front of her. He'd just lifted her up there. I could see it in the positions, in the way his hands were just withdrawing from her sides, in the way she was settling her weight onto the counter's edge and finding her balance. The counter was chest-high on her when she was sitting. It put her face at his face's level. He was looking at her, not at Sagara, at Kaya, with an expression I had no word for in any language I possessed. The expression of a man who has been in a fire and come out the other side and is now looking at the specific reason he went through it and finding the reason sufficient. More than sufficient. He reached up and brushed something from her hair, ash, probably, or dust from the ride, with the kind of touch that tries very hard not to reveal how afraid the person was. The gentleness of hands that spent the last 12 hours not knowing if they'd get to do this again. Kaya said something. Her voice was stronger than I'd expected, louder, more certain. The voice of a child who is still somewhat indignant about the events of the last 24 hours and is expressing this clearly to the relevant parent. Alu smiled. I haven't described his smile before because I didn't see it until that moment. It rearranged his face completely. Not the way that some smiles do, the big, performed ones, the ones that are trying to communicate something to an audience. This one was involuntary. The smile of someone ambushed by relief. He leaned down slightly so their faces were level. And he whispered. I was too far away to hear it. The room wasn't large, but it was large enough, and he was speaking low, and the whisper was for Kaya and Sagara and no one else in the world. And I stood at the far end of the room like a man who has wandered into a painting. He doesn't fully understand, and is doing his best to hold still and not disturb the light. Sagara heard it. She was standing to his left, and she heard it, and something happened in her face that I will try to describe and probably fail at. It was like watching someone put something down. Something heavy. Something they'd been carrying for a long time, maybe longer than just the 6 hours at the canyon mouth. Maybe longer than that, days or weeks. The particular weight of worry about a child who is sick, and a journey that needs completing, and a world that does not always cooperate with the things you need it to do. She put it down, just for a moment, and in that moment her face was so young it startled me. Kaya laughed. The laugh of a 4-year-old who has just been told something that pleased her. Sudden and complete and entirely uncomplicated. The way children's joy is uncomplicated before they learn that happiness is something you have to be careful about. I looked away. Not out of discomfort, I want to be clear about that. I looked away because the moment was too whole to be looked at straight on, the way certain lights are. The way the sun just after it clears the horizon is not something you put your eyes directly on. I looked at the wall, at a shelf of dry goods, at a tin of something, at my own hands which were older than I usually thought of them as being. Cassius Webb had moved to the other side of the room and was doing something with supplies that did not require his attention, and allowed him to be present without witnessing. He was, I understood in that moment, a man who had seen things he chose not to discuss, and who kept a back room open for people passing through for reasons the maps didn't account for. I thought about what it cost him to operate that way, in a territory that asked you constantly to pick a side and stay on it. I added him to the log later, just his name and one line, a man who holds space without filling it. Kaya was talking again, that continuous, assured child voice, and now Sagara was talking back, and the room had a different quality than it had 60 seconds before. Warmer, not in temperature, in the other way. I should have left. Good sense and good manners both suggested leaving. I didn't. What kept me was the cough. Kaya coughed and everything in the room changed. Not dramatically, not the way it does in stories where a cough becomes the plot. A single cough, dry and tight, the kind that comes from deep and doesn't produce much and tells the person listening, if they've been listening to it long enough, exactly what they need to know about how it is and how it isn't getting better. Sagara was across the room in a movement that seemed to skip the intermediate steps, her hand on the child's back, her other hand at Kaya's forehead, and Alu, who had stepped back slightly to let the mother and child reunion have its space, stepped forward again, and the three of them were a knot, the tight and particular knot of a family that has learned to close ranks around the thing that needs protecting. Cassius Webb said, without turning from what he was doing, "The medicine." "I have it," Alu said. His English was careful and precise, and clearly something he'd built deliberately, word by word, from scratch. "We have what we need." "You have what you came for?" "Yes." A pause. "Then you'll stay tonight," Cassius Webb said. "Don't tell me you're moving on in this smoke with a sick child. I've got room in the back." Another pause, longer. I saw Alu glance at Sagara, not for permission, not exactly, more like a confirmation. She was still focused on Kaya, but something in her posture shifted slightly, and he seemed to read it with the ease of a man who has been reading that particular posture for years. "Thank you," he said. Cassius Webb nodded once. "There's a kitchen through that door." "Not much, but it's stocked, and you're welcome to it." He said this to Alu, but he glanced at me when he said it, and I understood that I was being included in the invitation. The invitation of a man who has decided that something is about to happen in his kitchen and who has, for reasons he'll probably never explain to anyone, decided that the man with the log should see it. I don't know how he knew about the log, but he looked at it once in my jacket pocket and looked back up at my face and seemed to make a decision. I took out the log, found a fresh page. November 5th evening, Webb's post, the kitchen. The kitchen was small. Stone floor, low ceiling, a window that looked out on the courtyard where the well was. A fireplace that was more a cooking hearth than anything else, already going. Cassius Webb had evidently kept it lit against the evening cold. A counter along one wall, a rough table with 2 chairs. It smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and something else, something faint and medicinal that I associated with Kaya's condition without being able to name the specific plant. I came in last and stayed near the door, which is my natural position in situations I don't fully understand. Close enough to observe, positioned to exit, doing my best to be useful without being obtrusive. Alu carried Kaya in. She had her arms around his neck, and she was listing slightly with the tiredness of a child who has spent more than 24 hours in more adventure than she'd been ready for, the adrenaline long burned off and the exhaustion coming in behind it. Her eyes were half open. She was still talking, that same continuous quiet commentary on the world that I'd noticed earlier, but slower now, the words coming apart at the edges. He set her on the counter. Not the table, the counter. And I understood the why of it immediately. The table had 2 chairs and Sagara would need one of them, and the counter was the right height for what needed to happen next, which was Kaya needing to be at eye level with her father while he prepared the medicine. He lifted her with both hands at her waist and set her on the edge of the counter, and she settled there with the trusting weight of a child who has never had a reason to doubt the hands that lift her. And then he looked into her eyes and whispered. I was close enough this time, closer than I'd been in the other room, and the kitchen was quieter, the fire low, the world outside gone dark and still. I heard it. Not all of it, some of it was Apache, and I had maybe 40 words between me and complete ignorance. But I heard the shape of it, the rhythm, and I heard the 3 words at the end that were in English because that was, perhaps, the only language in which he knew she would understand them with absolute certainty. She was 4 years old and had been moving between languages her whole short life, and sometimes the most important things need to be said in the tongue that lands most surely. "You are found." That was what he whispered. Not "I found you," not "we're safe now." "You are found." I wrote it in the log before I could think too carefully about whether writing it was the right thing to do. I wrote it because it was the kind of thing that evaporates if you don't catch it, the kind of thing that lives only in the moment of its saying and then becomes something else. A memory, a story, a thing that gets described and redescribed until the original is worn away. "You are found." I didn't fully understand it then. I've been understanding it in pieces ever since. The medicine Alu made for Kaya smelled of something I'd never encountered. A root, maybe, or bark, prepared in a way I didn't recognize. He worked at the counter beside her, methodical, and she watched his hands the way children watch adults do things they intend to understand someday, with a kind of patient, assessing focus that was almost scientific. Sagara sat at the table and watched both of them. I don't think she was aware of me. Or if she was, I was furniture, background, the way strangers become background when something important is happening. I was fine with that. I have, as I've mentioned, made a life of being the kind of person that situations accommodate without requiring. I watched the 3 of them in that kitchen for, I checked the log, 40 minutes. I know because I looked at my watch when I came in and again when I decided to leave, and the space between those marks was 40 minutes that felt, in the moment and still in the memory, like no particular amount of time at all. Kaya drank the medicine, made a face, said something that was clearly a complaint. Alu said something back that made her reconsider. She drank the rest. Then she leaned sideways and put her head on her father's shoulder and was asleep within, I think, 3 minutes. He didn't move, stood there with the child's weight on his shoulder and his hands loose at his sides and his eyes on the middle distance, not quite looking at anything. Sagara got up from the table. She moved to him, to them, both of them, and she put her hand on Kaya's back and her other hand, after a moment, on Alu's arm. They stood like that. The fire crackled, the wind moved outside. Somewhere in the courtyard, one of the horses shifted and settled. I left. I'm not sure they noticed me go. I'm not sure it mattered. Some moments are complete in themselves, and the witnesses are incidental. What I know is that when I stepped out of that kitchen into the cold courtyard dark, I felt the specific and unfamiliar sensation of having seen something true. Not dramatic, not heroic in the way that word usually gets used in this territory. Just true. I walked to where Trouble was tied and stood with him in the dark for a while, my hand on his neck, feeling the warmth of him and listening to him breathe. "You are found." I wrote it again that night in the log at the top of a fresh page. And for the first time in a long time, looking at the words on the page, I thought about what it would mean to be found. Not to find, anyone can find, given enough persistence and good enough sight lines. To be found. To be the person on the counter, eye level with someone who chose to come through fire to get to you, receiving the word that tells you the searching is over. I sat with that question until the fire in my own small camp burned down to coals. I did not arrive at an answer. But I was a different weight, going to sleep, than I'd been waking up. That counts for something. That might count for everything. This is not a thing I do. In 17 years of riding, logging, working spreads from the Sangars to the Sonoran border, I have woken before dawn with the reliability of a man whose body has been trained to treat sleep as a practical transaction. You take what you need. You get up when the work requires it. You don't linger. It's not virtue. It's just habit, the same as keeping the log, the same as checking the horse's legs after a hard ride. A system you build and then maintain because the alternative is the slow erosion of everything you thought you knew about yourself. I overslept. The sun was already clear of the eastern ridge when I opened my eyes, the fire long cold, the frost on the ground catching the morning light and turning it into something almost beautiful. Trouble was watching me from about 4 feet away with the expression he gets when he's decided I've been asleep long enough and is waiting for me to reach the same conclusion independently. "I know," I told him. He looked unconvinced. I checked the log, November 6th, Added the time later than I liked and the weather clear, cold, frost on the ground. Wind gone. The smoke from the canyon fire had thinned overnight, the absence of it so complete that I kept looking toward the eastern ridge expecting to see it, and finding only the pale winter blue of a sky that had decided for one morning to cooperate. I made coffee, packed what I'd unpacked, did the small, deliberate work of putting a camp back into traveling order, the work I usually do on reflex, but that morning I did with attention, noticing each step, rolling the blanket, checking the panniers, checking the hobbles, checking Trouble's shoes because we had ground to cover and the stone had been rough coming in. It was the kind of morning that wants to be written down and then keeps giving you more to write. I was on the second cup of coffee when Cassius Webb appeared at the post's back door and stood there looking out at the courtyard with the expression of a man who has risen early, done everything he intended to do, and is now assessing the remainder. "They're up," he said when I caught his eye. "How's the child?" "Sleeping better. Ate this morning, which is better than the last few days, apparently." He crossed the courtyard to the well and pulled up the bucket with the ease of a man who has done it thousands of times. "Medicine seems to be helping." "Good." He filled a pot he'd brought out with him, looked at my coffee. "That fresh?" "Fresh enough." He came and poured himself a cup from my pot without ceremony, which I appreciated. An honest man, Cassius Webb. Takes what he needs, doesn't perform a negotiation around it. "You heading out today?" he asked. "That was the plan. But," I looked at the post's building. "Didn't want to leave without," I stopped. Without what exactly? I'd spoken before the thought was complete. "Without saying something," Cassius Webb said. "I suppose." He drank the coffee, let the silence be what it was. After a moment, "You could just go, they'd understand. They're used to people passing through." "I know. But you're going to say something anyway." "Probably." He considered me. "You kept writing in that log all night." "You could tell." "I could see your light." He gestured vaguely toward where I'd camped. "Little light on until maybe 2 in the morning." I thought about what I'd written. Pages and pages, more than I'd written in a single night since I don't know when. The canyon, the waiting, the kitchen, the whisper, all of it in my cramped, utilitarian handwriting that had never been designed for anything more than practical notation, and was now full of sentences that I kept rereading to see if they said what I meant. Most of them didn't. A few of them did. "I'm trying to understand something," I told him. "Most people who come through here are," he said without inflection. "Not kind, not unkind, just true." He went back inside. I finished my coffee and sat for a while longer with the frost and the pale sky and the feeling of being at the edge of something I hadn't named yet. They came out around mid-morning. All 3 of them. Kaya first, which surprised me until I realized it made sense. The child goes first into a space to test whether it's safe, and the adults watch from the doorway while she establishes the coast is clear. Except Kaya wasn't testing safety. She decided the courtyard was interesting and was going into it on those terms, with the momentum of a 4-year-old who has slept and eaten and is ready for the world to provide more material for investigation. She went straight to Trouble, which alarmed me for about half a second before I remembered that Trouble is, despite his name, genuinely excellent with children. Patient in a way he is not patient with adults, as though he's made a separate assessment of small people and found them worth accommodating. He stood still and lowered his head, and let Kaya put her hand flat on his nose with the ceremony of a person performing a significant greeting, which she clearly was. Ilu and Sagara came out behind her. Ilu had the pack, the one they'd left with Cassius Webb, now reorganized for travel, slung over one shoulder. Sagara was wearing a different blanket than the day before, darker, heavier. The morning cold earned it. They stopped when they saw me. Not with alarm, I want to be clear about that. More with the slight recalibration of people who had expected the courtyard to be empty and found it occupied, and were now running a quick assessment of whether this changed anything. I raised my hand, slow and open. The universal language of I am not a threat, and I'm aware of the awkwardness of my presence here. Ilu looked at me for a moment, then he said, "You were in the kitchen." I apologize for." "You didn't do anything wrong." His voice was the same careful English from the previous evening, precise. A man who has built his vocabulary deliberately and does not waste it. You were standing near the door. You stayed quiet. I hope I didn't intrude. You didn't. Kaya had not stopped examining Trouble, who was bearing the examination with equanimity. Sagara was watching me with the same quality of attention she'd had at the canyon mouth, not unfriendly, not warm. Assessing, the look of a person deciding what category to put you in. I had my log in my hand. I'd taken it out before they appeared, intending to write something, and now I was just holding it, which made me feel conspicuous. I keep a record, I said, of what I observe. It's not a journal, it's practical mostly. Ilu looked at the log, then at me. What did you record? A fair question, a question that deserved an honest answer. The canyon, I said, the fire watching you come through, and last night. I stopped. I heard what you said to her in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to listen, but I was close enough. Silence, the particular silence of a man deciding whether he's offended. You heard the English, he said finally. Yes. What did you hear? And I understood then, with the clarity that sometimes arrives too late to be as useful as you want it to be, that this was not a test of my honesty. It was something else. He wanted to know what had landed in the ears of a stranger who had no context for it, no history with them, no stake in the outcome. He wanted to know what those 3 words sounded like when stripped of everything except the words themselves. You are found, I said. He looked at me for what felt like a long time. Then he nodded once, not the nod of agreement, the nod of confirmation, the slight incline of the head that means yes, that was what I said, and you heard it correctly. It's what my father said to me, he said, when I was lost, when I was a child. He paused. I was lost in a canyon, a different canyon. He found me on the 3rd day. He said this without visible emotion, which I recognized as not the same as without emotion. He said it in Apache, but later, when I was older, I tried to find it in other languages, the exact meaning. He shifted the pack on his shoulder. In English, it's closest. You are found, not I found you, that's about the finder. You are found, that's about the one who was lost. I thought about this for a long time. Later, not then. Then I was just standing in the courtyard in the frost, holding my log, looking at a man who had just handed me something without seeming to know he'd done it. Sagara said something to him in Apache, short and quiet. He answered her without taking his eyes off me. She asks if you are all right, he said. I blinked. I'm fine. Why would? You are crying, he said, with the same neutrality, observational. I touched my face and found, with some surprise, that I was in fact crying. Not dramatically. Nothing that would require notice in a different kind of moment. Just the quiet leak of something that had been building since the canyon and had found an exit while I wasn't paying attention. I'm sorry, I said, which was absurd, and he looked like he thought so too. Don't be, he said something to Sagara. She looked at me differently after that, still assessing, but the category had shifted. Something warmer, not pity, more like recognition. She says, Alu said, that grief that finds air is better than grief that stays inside. I wrote that down that night with the rest of it. I've been carrying it since. They were leaving by late morning. I wasn't going the same direction. They were heading southwest, toward a settlement I didn't know, with Kaya's medicine packed carefully in the center of the saddlebag where nothing could compress it. And I was heading north, back toward Santa Fe. Back toward the long work of a life that did not have a clear shape yet, but had, as of the last 2 days, some new material in it that I was going to have to account for. Cassius Webb stood in the post's doorway with his leather apron and his deliberately trimmed beard, and watched us all sort ourselves out with the expression of a man who has seen this courtyard hold a lot of departures, and has learned to let them go without too much ceremony. Kaya came to me before they mounted. I don't know why. Maybe Alu or Sagara directed her, I couldn't tell. Maybe she did it on her own. She came and stood in front of me and looked up at me with Alu's dark eyes and her mother's particular stillness, and held out her hand. In her palm was a stone, small, rounded, the kind of river stone you pick up because it fits in the hand exactly right. I looked at her, she looked at me. I took the stone. She turned and went back to her parents without any further explanation, which was, I understood, the whole point. No translation, no ceremony, just the stone and the understanding that the stone was meant to be given and had been given, and that was the end of it. I still have it. It's in my left jacket pocket. I take it out sometimes when I'm writing and turn it in my fingers, feeling the weight of it. I put it in the log that night. pressed it against the page and traced around it with my pen, making a record of its shape. I don't know why, it seemed important not to just describe it. The ride north was 3 days. I spent most of it writing. Not notes, not the usual practical log entries, distances and weather and observations. Something longer. Something I kept having to restart because I kept beginning in the wrong place. Kept arriving at the kitchen or the canyon before I'd laid enough foundation. Kept trying to reach the whisper before the reader. Before I understood why it mattered. On the second night, camped in a dry wash with a good fire and a clear sky and trouble dozing nearby, I wrote the sentence that I've been working toward without knowing it. There is a difference between being safe and being found. I looked at it for a while, added, I have been safe, more or less, for 34 years. I'm beginning to understand that the other thing is different. I didn't write anything else that night. I didn't need to. I've been back in Santa Fe for 3 months now. The log from November is full in a way that logs usually aren't. The pages are dense. The margins are crowded with additions and corrections and small drawings I made of the canyon and the courtyard and the shape of Kaya's stone. It's not a practical document anymore. It's something else. I'm not sure what to call it. I've thought about Alou almost every day. About the specific grammar of what he said. You are found, passive voice, the burden on the state rather than the act. About his father saying it in Apache and Alou translating it into English because English was what would land most surely in a 4-year-old's understanding. About the way language carries things across distances it wasn't designed to cross. I've thought about Sagara at the canyon mouth, about the 7 hours, about the choice to wait rather than to know. I've thought about my wife, about the good blanket, about all the things I let become endings when they might have been with different choices, pauses, about the difference between letting go and putting down, about what it would cost to still be at the canyon mouth, waiting, and whether the cost of not waiting is higher. These are large questions for a man whose log was designed for distances and weather. I'm working on being large enough for them. Last week I was in town. Supplies, the same prosaic errand that led me to Webb's post in the first place. The world running on salt and coffee and lamp oil regardless of what else is happening. And I stopped in front of a church I've walked past dozens of times without entering. I didn't go in, but I stopped and I stood there for a moment and I thought, you are found. Not to myself, not as a statement of current fact, more as a question, more as a direction, the way you hold a compass and see where the needle settles. I put my hand in my pocket and felt the weight of the stone. Walked on. The log is almost full. I'm going to need a new one. I've been thinking about what to write in it. The same things, dates, distances, observations. What I saw, not what I felt. Except now I know those two things aren't as separate as I used to think. Now I know that what you see and what you feel are the same event, just described from different angles. Now I know that the most important thing you can write down is often the thing you think is too small to bother with. The child's hand on your face. The stone in a palm extended toward a stranger. The 3 words at the end of a whisper in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and something medicinal that I still can't name. You are found. I wrote it at the top of the new log's first page, before anything else. Not as a record. As a reminder.